A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends and participants who've joined across various jurisdictions for this very interesting topic, drone regime in India, which is significantly liberalized. To kickstart the proceedings, would want to hand it over to Nishith Desai, founder of the law firm Nishith Desai and Associates. Over to you, Nishith Bhai, to kickstart the session.
Thank you very much, Josefa, and all my friends around the world, and my co-panelists, Anirudh, Tanya, and Smith, and everybody around. This is a very exciting subject. In fact, drone holds a huge future for India and even for the world. And we are getting into a completely new regime now. And as you all know that, and let me tell you a little bit about the firm as well. We at Nishith Desai Associates are what we call India-centric global law firm with offices in Silicon Valley, New York, Mumbai, Amsterdam, Munich, Singapore, Delhi, Bangalore. And our approach to practice is what you call bit futuristic. So what we try to do, we do a lot of research and academics. And our philosophy is that every new technology, every new business model, every new social, political, economic development brings along with it a new strategic, legal, tax, or ethical issue. And what we try to do is to, look at trends, and we do trend assessment and forecasting, see what new technologies will be coming in the future, what are the other development business models will be developed, what are socio-political issues coming up, and we look to next 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now and try to visualize what will be the future legal, tax, or ethical issues. And we therefore spend almost 40% of our time on research academics. Because many a times, and especially in the current days, the technology is advancing at the speed of thought, even faster than the thought. And things happen, so rapidly that by the time your product comes on the market, our regulations are not in place, our ecosystem is not in place. So we try to do, some kind of visualization, of course, again, based on the theory that future may be uncertain, but is not unthinkable. And therefore, we try to say, let us visualize today, at least, even if we cannot, it may be fuzzy logic, but at least you can definitely think as to what could be possible issues. And our experience the last 30 years has been often, you take a long time to develop a product. Product is about to enter the market. And when you develop new product today, within 3 years, there are many other competitors who enter the space. And, apart from that, you have to deal with the regulatory framework and stuff like that. So your entry is again delayed by a substantial amount of time because regulations are not in place. And in fact, as a matter of fact, we specialized blockchain, crypto in 2012-13, drones in 5 years ago. And we believe that, and in fact, one of the companies had plans to bring flying cars. And so we are now specialized in flying cars as well. And the company had a plan that, okay, there are 5 cities in the world which are most suited to bring flying cars. Mumbai was one of that. And at that point of time, I think I was with the chief minister and we are talking about it. And we said they will bring flying cars to India, but our regulatory regime will not be in place. Okay. So drones is going to evolve into a number of different kind of things in future. And, so we have to be ready with the regime. Today we have a time, 3, 5 years or whatever time, drones came and we are not ready. Okay, then in a hurried fashion, we brought first set of rules regulation, manual. Then came second one. Again, there were some issues. Now suddenly we have got the new ones that are coming up, which are actually excellent piece. What has been done at this point in time is now at par with the world, and it may be beyond in some respects. So we have learned a good lesson But drones, I believe, will generate possibly the highest amount of employment as well, both in terms of manual drones and otherwise. It is going to change the ecosystem. And I was talking to one of the ministers, and I said that when you build roads or you build, bridges and other things, okay, uh, if the payback period is 15, 20 years or beyond, then, better rethink what will be your new competition. Your flying cars will be new competition. Your transportation will be through drones. Drones will be a bigger competition. So do you really need to build roads, or do you really need to develop ecosystem for the drones? And as you all know, in the US at one time, railways was the major, medium of transportation, goods and passengers and everything. But when aeroplanes came, aeroplanes became so cheap that more people fly by aeroplane than the trains today at times. And same way, we should not underestimate the potential of the drones today. And our regulatory regime, which has now been brought at par, or at least in many ways improved a lot. I think let us make most out of it. And there were restrictions relating to foreign owned and controlled entities couldn't have the drones. Now it is liberalized. Authorizations, registrations, and permits that were like bureaucratic regime we had. Now again, that is being relaxed, and I'm sure you're going to talk to Josefa and all the team members and Smith. Then operational zones, the zoning issues, research and development, new use cases, and stuff like that. A lot of interesting things are there. And it is going to have a lot of impact on many other industries around. So, what are those implications? What is going to happen? And I welcome you to this discussion so that you not only know about the opportunities, but also develop your business in a practical way and find either collaborations or you know, get together. It's a world that we want to change for the better, but of course together. So, you have a lot of exciting time ahead of you. And I would really like you all to take advantage of the new ecosystem at the early stage so that you are in right time at right place and have a great successful time ahead. Thank you very much, and I would hand it over back to Josefa. Jose, over to you.
Thank you.
Have a very exciting evening. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nishith Bhai, for these opening remarks. Of course, they're very pertinent. It is the first mover advantage which all of us are looking to discuss and take. Without further ado, very, very quick introduction, to our panelists. We, of course, have Smith Shah, who's the director of Drone Federation of India. He wears multiple hats. He not only had a health tech startup in the past, but he also has a razor sharp focus on drones. He's been focusing a lot from an advocacy, civil, and defense perspective, and is a member of several committees which have been set up by the government of India on drones. So, welcome to you, Smith, for joining us on this session. Alongside Smith, we have Anirudh Majumdar, who's a senior member of the drones practice at Nishith Desai Associates. Avid drone enthusiast who loves writing on topics and researching from a cross-border perspective. Alongside Anirudh, we also have Tanya Kukade from Nishith Desai Associates, a new joinee to the drones practice. And it will also be me, which is Josefa Tawawala. I lead the disruptive technologies practice at Nishith Desai Associates along with the drones practice, and I'll be moderating the event. So let's, we've got this excellent panel, and we've already started the webinar. I want to just take a minute to give a quick download, to our audience what has happened, right? We've come a long positive way in the past 6 to 7 years. Some of y'all who've been closely associated with this ecosystem will realize that in 2014 was the first official guidance circular which came out from the government. And essentially that first circular which came out from the government had a blanket ban on the use of drones for civilian use. Till further guidelines are issued. So from 2014, the first official circular came out, which was nothing but a blanket ban. And it took 4 years for the regulations to come in. The first regulations came in 2018. They were drone card guidelines. They were a bit, patchy, sketchy, but whatever said and done, it actually legitimized the use of drones. There were certain pitfalls, which industry kept commenting on, and then came the second drone law. The second drone law came in March 2021. They tried to iron out things, but it became a circular Ferris wheel, which actually ended up creating more issues, vis-a-vis the previous regime. Basis which, again, there were heavy criticisms from the industry, pursuant to which just a week back, we have a new drone law, which became effective on August 25, 2021, extremely liberalized in many which ways, and hopefully will boost the ecosystem. So this was a quick background. Now getting on to the new drone law, which is effective as of now. What does it extend to? It essentially extends to drones which are registered in India, or drones which are operated in India, which may have been imported outside India. It also applies to civilian use of drones. It also applies to drones used by government, state agencies, and other wings of the government. But these rules the new law does not specifically apply to naval, military, and Air Force operations. That's directly handled at a GOI level. Then come to the classification. The classification, like the old law, they have been classified from a size perspective, starting from the teeniest, miniest of drones, which is the nano drone, from up to 250 grams, and then the really large ones, which are large drones. So from nano to large, from 250 grams up to 500 kilos. And the drones essentially include your normal UAVs. They also include hybrids. They also include autonomous. They also include rotorcrafts. And of course, they include the larger unmanned systems. So this is the scope of the new law. I would actually, at this point in time, have my colleague come in, Anirudh. So Anirudh, specifically, basis the previous regimes which were there, which were highly criticized, from a multiple authorization permit level perspective. How do you see the new law kind of being progressive and simplify things?
Right. Thanks, Josefa, and good evening, everyone. So, as Josefa mentioned, the earlier rules actually drew a lot of criticism because of the sheer number of authorizations and certifications that was required at each stage. Like every stakeholder had a different sort of requirement. You first need an airworthiness certificate, an operator permit, and so on. But very fortunately, these requirements have been greatly simplified, and under the current rules, there are just two requirements for drone operations as of now. The first is the type certificate, which is basically linked with the operations of the drones. And the second is a unique identification number, which is a UIN. And this is actually linked with each drone per se. So again, the emphasis is actually on drone operations rather than manufacturing or import of drones. And these requirements are linked again to operations. So I'll begin with the type certificate. Now, unless there is an express exemption under the rules, a drone is actually not permitted to be operated in India unless it conforms to a type certificate. Notably, nano drones, which are the smallest category of drones, have been exempted from this requirement, and so have model remotely piloted drones, which is a separate category meant for recreational, educational, and some such purposes. So what exactly will be a type certificate? Now, as the name suggests, the certificate will be issued in relation to a type of drone, and hence all drones which belong to that category or that type must comply with the type certificate which is relevant to them. So the rules do not exactly specify the contents of the certificate, but it is the DGCA or the Directorate General of Civil Aviation which will issue this certificate. And the rules provide that the government of India may even provide for standards for obtaining a type certificate. This will again be based on the recommendations of the Quality Council of India, which is a public-private partnership organization. And this is important because even for the standard setting process of the type certificate, the industry should have a say. Another smaller point is that in these standards, the rules say that they might be promoting Indian technologies and Indian regional navigation systems. But the exact nature of this promotion is unclear as of now. The application process for this is supposed to be through the DigiSky platform. And first of all, it will be examined by the QCI, which I just mentioned, or some testing agencies which are authorized. And based on the recommendations of these agencies, the DGCA is actually required to issue a type certificate. In stark contrast with earlier rules, there is a clear timeline of 60 days for these agencies to examine and 15 days for the DGCA to then issue the type certificate. So this gives much needed clarity because most stakeholders would need some idea about, okay, how much time will this application take and what is the timeline for getting a type certificate so that they can commence operations and so on. There is also a relaxation which is provided to drones which have been imported into India and which have already been approved by one of the contracting states to the Convention of International Civil Aviation. In this case, the government might notify certain such drones and the DGCA will then issue the type certificate bypassing the entire examination process. Coming to the second requirement, this is a much simpler requirement on the face of it. This is basically the registration of the drone and the obtaining of the UIN or the unique identification number. So again, this is a requirement before drones can be operated. And the application for this is also through the DigiSky platform. There is no timeline prescribed for this entire process of giving a UIN though, which is actually a slight concern because while a timeline for issuing a type certificate has been given, something similar for a registration would also have been helpful. But this is anyway a one-time process. So, but of course, it would be helpful if a timeline is also specified for this process. So, Josefa, back to you.
No, thank you so much. I think overall, from a UIN timeline perspective, once the digital sky is up and running, since it's a one-time registration, we do not see it as that much of a hurdle. But thank you so much. I think the other big takeaway, and before I go to Smith, the big takeaway here is the relaxation for the entry of foreign players in the Indian market. As some of you all will know, since 2018, when the first law came, there were express restrictions whereby foreign owned and controlled Indian subsidiaries, or if a foreign entity held 51% in an Indian company, those entities, even though they were Indian, incorporated, registered, they were not allowed to own and operate drones. This also was a hindrance from an overall investment perspective, overall joint venture, partnerships, technology collaborations. And this is one of the great liberalizations, amongst other things which have happened, where this express restriction has been relaxed, which essentially means that foreign companies, bases their Indian subsidiaries in India, or having 51% ownership and control in India, can actually own and operate drones. So we see this as a great opportunity from both sides, even for the Indian industry, plus the international industry, and a good collaboration on that. But moving further, I think it is very important to get the views of someone who has been closely associated with this space, from not only from a government perspective but also from an industry perspective. So over to you, Smith. How do you see the implementation of these rules, generally from an operation, registration, monitoring perspective, considering you've been involved so closely?
Thanks, Josefa. Thanks, Nishith Bhai, for having this session and inviting me over. I hope I'm audible to everyone. So, thank you so much for having this session. And before I, sort of get into the specifics, just wanted to, put it out there in the open that it's probably one of the first times in the history of the country that in just 4 months of time, regulation has been repealed and has been liberalized. So while the regulation has been liberalized, and that in itself is a very bold and a very positive move. The same thing happening in just 4 months is another addition in terms of understanding that the government has now realized what is the support that is required for this industry, and the importance that the government is giving to this industry. Addition to the fact that just a few days back on 27th of the last month, we saw that 27th of the July, we saw that a drone actually dropped a few explosives at an Indian Air Force base, and the government, rather than clamping down on the drone policy, even after such an incident, has liberalized the policy. Just typically shows the bold vision that the government clearly understands the threat to drones is separate, and the promotion of drones that is very much required is separate, and that's being addressed through this liberal policy. Now, when it comes to the specifics of the policy, I feel the first thing, which is the permissions that have gone out, has been the first sort of positive. Second, yes, there is a timeline to almost all the activities, and for the specific UIN case that Anirudh mentioned, it is expected that the registration will be automatic in nature, which means we'll fill a form, press OK, and we'll get a unique identification number, which would essentially mean there is no timeline required. But I understand it's not written in the rules. However, it's expected so. So these are the few things, and I believe that the only challenge will now be to bring Digital Sky platform up and running, which we believe as a country of software experts and developing a simple registration and certificate generation platform, which is the scope of the Digital Sky right now, would not be a challenge. It's just a effort that is required, and we are expecting that, just like the rules say that in 30 days airspace maps have to be released, which is the green zone, yellow zone, and the red zone. By the way, this was one of the issues that we've been seeing since 2014, that there was a mention of the airspace maps, but no specific timeline and no methodology through which they were going to be released. But with no permission being required in green zone, and the government's bold decision to say that they will release the map in 30 days itself, shows that the government wants to hold itself accountable as well on various actions that are required for this industry to start. So the maps is one of the areas which is the base of the entire drone ecosystem in India, and these are the few things which I believe will be very important. With the last point before I hand it over back to you, Josefa, which is the penalization. The previous regulation actually brought in heavy penalties. It had compounding, double compounding, as well as some offenses, most offenses being cognizable. But in this regime, we see that most of the penalties have been reduced, and only one or two very highly, sort of dangerous activities being, penalized is also another, sort of thing, that it's not just promotion of drones, but also responsible fees and penalties and all of that also has been taken into account, noting that there will be a lot of startups and young companies that will invest money in this ecosystem. So those were the few thoughts that I had. I'll hand it over back to you, Josefa. Thanks for having me over.
No, absolutely. I think this is great clarity, Smith. I think, as you rightly pointed out, right, we went into a regime in early 2021, which actually went back in time for 3-4 years. And within 4 months, with a complete broad brush, there were these new rules which became law on August 25th, which has actually in some form, shaken up the industry in a positive way. And one more small point which I want to add is, even from a registration process, basis industry people, and we've been closely associated with the system, that the Digital Sky platform with Smith mentioned, we understand that the government has already made a lot of progress, because that platform has been in the works for a few years. So it's not that they're going to start from scratch, which only helps in the readiness of the entire digitization process for approvals. On this note, again, I would like to go back to Anirudh And Anirudh, it may be helpful. I know Smith touched, a little bit on it from a zone perspective, but generally from an operations perspective, how do you see that, the government has divided, areas within India geographically? Any inputs, thoughts on the same?
Right. So as Smith mentioned, basically, there will be an interactive map which the government has committed to publish around September 25th of this year. And the map is supposed to be an interactive map which divides the entire airspace into three types of zones. So one is the green zone, one is the yellow zone, and one is the red zone. So just to give an idea about how these zones will work. So the green zone will actually be up to a height of around 120 meters or 400 feet, except areas near the airport where the height restriction is more strict. All the airspace above the green zone will be a yellow zone, including closer to the airports. And third is the red zone, which will basically be strictly classified by or specified by the government specially. And whatever has not been designated as a red zone or a yellow zone is going to be a green zone. So in that sense, because as Smith mentioned, the green zone, there is no requirement of any permission from anybody. On the other hand, the yellow zone requires permissions from the air traffic control authorities, and the red zone requires the strictest permission requirement, which is from the central government itself. So this is actually a very positive development, because in order to operate in the green zone, basically you just need one type certificate and one UIN, and that is basically it. You just need to self-verify on the interactive map whether there are any special restrictions in the areas that you intend to operate in. But otherwise, it's an open field. So in this sense, I would say that the government seems to have taken a pragmatic view, because they have taken into account security concerns while designating red zones, but they have not made the requirements prohibitive either.
No, I think, again, very, very useful insights. It's permitted unless prohibited. And that's, again, a very, very, very welcome approach, which actually removes a lot of red tapeism, within the entire ecosystem. But on that note, Anirudh, especially when you mentioned about operations, is the new law only focusing on visual line of sight, or how does it look at, beyond visual line of sight operations slash autonomous drone operations? Any inputs on that also would be great for our participants.
Sure, Zephyr. So under the previous regimes, actually, before I go into that, for anybody who's unfamiliar with these terms, drones can be operated within visual line of sight, which is that the person operating the drone has an uninterrupted view of the drone, or they can be operated beyond visual line of sight, or BVLOS for short. And basically, this is when that view of the drone is not uninterrupted, and the drone could be far away or behind an obstacle, etc., etc. Similarly, drones may be remotely piloted. Basically, somebody is having a remote control in very crude terms, or they can be autonomous, where there is no person controlling it, but the drone is programmed in a certain way to be operated. So earlier, these kind of operations were not permitted, and even the March 2021 rules required a special permit in order to conduct BVLOS operations. So the new rules actually do not contain any express restrictions on or any specific permissions required for BVLOS or autonomous operations. In fact, there are very limited references to both types of operations, and only for model RPAs that we had mentioned earlier, that is where BVLOS operations are restricted. So while it is a huge positive that both of these operations are not restricted, since there is no guidance on this aspect and no standardization as such from a safety and security perspective, it is also a little unclear as to what a manufacturer or operator or any other stakeholder would be required to comply with at the time of applying for the type certificate, for example. So therefore, it would be helpful to obtain some guidance, so that there is some certainty beforehand, so that stakeholders can accordingly plan their business and their R&D operations. Similarly, another special type of operation is the carriage of payload. So under the earlier rules, on the positive side, the earlier rules only permitted carriage of goods under a specific license, which could be interpreted to mean that drones can only carry, drones cannot carry passengers and can only carry goods. But interestingly, there is no such specification in the present rules. In fact, the Civil Aviation Minister, Mr. Jyotiraditya Scindia himself, has said since the release of the drones that drone taxis may soon become a reality under the new drone regime. So this is a huge, huge positive that we have. In all likelihood, drone taxis would require a much more stringent process at the type certification level. But even then, at least these rules enable such operations. Secondly, similar to autonomous and BVLOS operations, there is again a lack of clarity in the guidelines because except some restricted items, such as weapons or hazardous goods, there are no guidelines on exactly what sort of payload can be carried and what sort of operations while conducting carriage is permitted. So this again might lead to a lack of clarity for operators because especially for commercial use of drones for deliveries or other logistics, it is not clear currently what sort of operations will actually be permitted and how the drone itself should be designed in order to obtain a type certificate. So I think that is a major takeaway on the operations front. And yeah, back to you, Zephyr.
No, thank you, Anirudh. I think let's split into two parts because there is a great thing which has happened where going back to the 2018 law, which was only subject to saying that drones will be allowed with visual line of sight. BBLS operations would not have been possible. Autonomous operations would not have been possible. This has been kind of relaxed and permitted in some form under this law. I think from a government and a ministerial perspective, what these rules and law has also done, within that they have given enabling powers to the government, to the ministry, to pass standard operating procedures, which we believe which will be released very soon, because as of a few days back, there were certain consortium members who've actually been granted BBLS approvals in India. Some of them are state bodies, some of them are private bodies. So there is a definite path which the government is following. But yes, I think the larger point is that any sort of SOPs, standard operating procedures, would be extremely welcomed by an industry from an overall planning perspective. With that, during a period of time, it would also be very important if there are certain inbuilt features which are required in drones, depending upon the operations. So if clarity could be given to the industry participants, that would also be welcome. So taking everything together, of course, the liberalization has happened, and which is a great step. But now, constantly, the government would need to ensure that it keeps up its game to ensure that finally all these operations become a reality. On this note, I would like to come back to Tanya and stitching Smith's point on the startup industry. In the previous law, Tanya, there were certain restrictions and there was a lot of criticism which was focused on the startup industry and from a research and development perspective. Your sense, Tanya, basis the new law, how has that changed? Has there been some liberalization on that front too?
Definitely, Josefa. So, as Smith also pointed out, this liberalized regime has opened so many gates for entry of new entities within the drone regime. So to say, startups or even authorized testing entities or drone manufacturers who have a GST identification number, they can conduct R&D operations without requiring, even a type certificate or a UIN and a prior permission. Like Anirudh pointed out, the authorization and the registration requirements, which were earlier very stringent in terms of, entry of startups. So they were made to comply with all of these requirements even prior to conducting the R&D activities. So, it made the whole process a little cumbersome. So startups would always have a roadblock in terms of entry into the drone regime in India. So in terms of conducting these activities by these entities, including startups, the new rules have allowed testing of drones in the green zones, which can be either within the premises of the person conducting the operations or within an open area in the green zone. So under his supervision, there is one slight distinction that we could observe in terms of the earlier rules, which necessitated that these testing and R&D activities had to be conducted around 50 meters away from uninvolved personnel. So in the new rules, if such a provision can be brought in with respect to a safety measure to ensure protection and safety of civilians, I think that would be a welcome move, because if there is a huge potential in terms of research and development, and this research and development should take place keeping in mind the safety of all those uninvolved civilians. So that would be definitely a welcome move. And another very important and notable point in terms of the new rules is that in the R&D operations, any drones can be utilized in terms of any size that may be specified under the new rules. And this can be right up to drones weighing up to 500 kgs. So there's no limit placed on the type of drones that can be utilized for R&D purposes by all these eligible entities. So from the only perspective that can be looked at from the futuristic perspective would be to keep a track of these operations, a UIN registration, just to have a hold of what is happening in the industry in terms of research can be taken up. And clarifications and guidelines are always welcome, given that R&D would act as the innovating point for industries to pitch in, to enter into the drone regime. So yeah, so this has definitely enabled an entry point for startups, and there is a long way to go with huge potential given the liberalized new regime, Josefa.
Excellent. I think very, very pertinent points, Tanya. I think the entire boost from a startup ecosystem is truly going to be welcomed. I would like to go to Smith, but before that, there are a plethora of questions which are coming in on the chat. Let me pick up a couple and then we can actually move to Smith. I think the first one is from Manoj, and he says that if an entity incorporated in India with 100% foreign holding, will it be allowed to import and operate drones in India? The simple answer is yes now, Manoj. Before that, it would not have been possible. The second is from Ria. She says that what is the applicability of the rules to companies manufacturing drones for use by naval and armed forces? There are different requirements. The moment you get into that space, there would be some sort of an industrial license also, which would kind of be triggered. Third one, and then after that we will move to Smith. The third question is from Nikhil Thorat. He says that would a license be required by foreign nationals to operate a drone in India? Are there any nation-specific restrictions? Yes, Nikhil, there could be restrictions on that. If there is a foreign national coming to India to operate a drone, that may be a little bit of a challenge, because to obtain a type certificate for an individual, essentially that individual needs to have an Indian passport and Aadhaar and PAN and so forth. So a typical foreign national, there may be some challenges. There are more questions, but we'll come back to it. But now, again, let's go back to Smith. Smith, considering what we've just heard on this session and what you've been hearing from the industry, it would be great if you can give us a pulse in terms of what are the people thinking? What are the people thinking? What are the federations thinking? What are multinationals thinking basis this new law? And how are they going to approach the industry?
Thanks, Josefa. In fact, it's just been a few days since when the new regulations came in, and we've already seen a lot of startups talking back to their investors and looking to raise funds. Those conversations have become really, really active now. In fact, a few announcements have also been made. In a record time, there is a company that has created a 100 crore, fund to boost to create a separate vertical of drone manufacturing. So this is the kind of response from an investment and expenditure perspective, if I may so say, that people have, been very open now verbally, as well as their pockets from a spending money perspective. That's the one part. From a second perspective, people are now talking about bigger drones, air taxis. In fact, we have an Indian company that's very actively working on building an urban air mobility vehicle, which is an air taxi, and it looks like in 12 months of time we'll at least have our first large, almost full scale size prototype built in India, being tested in India. So that's the kind of excitement, more investments, larger use cases, and bigger drones is what people are looking at. And last but not the least, just like what the rules say, yes, I know they don't specify much in detail about promoting made in India technologies, but the conversation suddenly has changed, not just about using drones, but manufacturing drones, designing drones, manufacturing drones, and making this a high value industry based on IP, built on IP, rather than just an assembly and service sort of industry, which always works on the low margins and stays in the service side. So that's the thought and the conversations that's been running around in the industry and various other forums.
Absolutely. I think it's brilliant, right, Smith? All of a sudden, within, a short span of 5 months, the perspective entirely has changed. I think the previous perspective was, excuse me, the previous perspective was, how do you survive? What will you do? How will we do it? Now, all of a sudden, the entire, the level playing fields have changed. The picture has become much larger. People are thinking big. Make in India initiatives are being promoted. Simultaneously, foreign technology collaborations are being talked up. It's just so wonderful to see so much of vibrance. But on that note, Rohit on the chat box has raised a very interesting question. I'll probably take a crack at it, and then Smith, it would be great if you could also chime in. Yeah. He says that just like what we see in social media space, do we foresee a future clampdown on drone regs, or are these regulations nuanced enough and future ready to deal with the complexities arising in the near future? So the question, honestly, Rohit, is very nuanced, because from a complexity perspective, as we mentioned, right, there constantly have to be developments, even from a regulatory perspective, standard operating procedures, testing live cases, which will evolve. So if you say that these are the regulations and this is the future, it is not a complete statement. The way we would look at it is, this is the bedrock, this is the foundation. Now it only needs to be topped and improved, basis use case scenarios. I don't know, Smith, basis your interactions with the government, do you think that there will be a reverse or a clampdown sort of approach going forward?
So, Josefa, I think I have a very interesting answer to this, which is, as you mentioned, this is the bedrock of the ecosystem, right? But there's one perspective that we need to understand. 5 months back, 4 months back, 5 months back, we already had a regulation that couldn't have been. There was it was not possible to clamp it down further, right? And the government has come back from there. So that's the first thing that we need to understand, that yes, we were in a clamped regime from 2014, 2018, and 2021 March. From there, we have come to the liberal state, which means not that we are not aware, of how to clamp it down. We were aware. We have done it 3 times, and from there we have come out. So most probably, we have already understood that clamping down is not going to help the business as well as national deployed on 20 July in Indian Air Force Base at Jammu. So there is no reason or thought process or logic because of which clampdown could happen. Second, we also need to understand this regulation very logically establishes the principles of any further sub-regulation as well, which is every drone that will be flying will need type certification. So yes, there may be much more detailed and much more work that will happen, but at the end of the day, if you have to fly the drone, it will only be a type certification. That type certification will be very easy probably for visual line of sight applications, bit more complex for beyond visual line of sight applications, supremely complex for air taxis. Similarly, anyone who buys such a drone, registers it, gets a UIN, and then tries to operate it will require training and pilot license. For visual line of sight, this may be very easy. For BVLOS, which is the delivery drones and beyond visual line of sight, other types of applications, this may be a little bit difficult. And urban air mobility, yes, they may be remote controlled or autonomous. So it can be a bit more complex. So there can only be technical requirements based on experiments which will come in, and that will be for the good because they'll ensure safety and through some safety mechanisms also security. But this legislation builds the boxes in which all of these frameworks will be put in. So there will not be probably any additional security clearance that will be required as a new set of requirement, because it was there in the 2021 March regulations and it has been got out. There is a requirement of a passport, for example. So that's what we need to understand. Strictness will only go towards the very specific application and the nuance that is already identified in this rule. There is no new requirement. There is only a requirement based on the type of application. That's what my take would be, Josefa.
No, I think excellent. Again, the comments are so to the point, and just to elaborate on this further, to Rohit, that a one size jacket approach is not being looked at. That's exactly what Smith is saying. So the bedrock is here. Now, of course, there are questions which we are discussing, that what will happen in autonomous, what will happen in BVLS, what will happen in commercial delivery. But that is something I think which the government is very cognizant of. They've taken the first step in terms of liberalizing the space. Now what will follow is, on a use case basis, bells and whistles will need to be carefully built. In fact, bells and whistles specifically, even on the operations front, would need to be considered. Because currently, and that will also answer one of the questions, that from a due diligence, what you should be aware of if you're engaging a third party. So currently, basis the current law, one is a type certificate, which is a must, which Anirudh kind of elaborated on. The second is, of course, a UIN, which is a unique identification number associated with the drone. And thirdly, depending upon the category, you need a license holder, qualified and approved license holder. Now, things like how will the flight operations be manned vis-a-vis the digital sky platform? Are the improvements going to be made on a real-time traffic management system? All these things, I guess, will only unfold once the ecosystem kind of takes off. Yes, people are putting in some concerns on the chat box from a safety perspective. Some people have also written to us, but I think for the larger audience, the take is that the bedrock of the legal framework has been set. Now it is up to the government to actually propel these operations, the drone operations, and simultaneously keep coming out with relevant bells and whistles to kind of ring fence and mitigate liabilities. Let's again go back to a few questions. There are too many on the chat box. We've covered Roy's question. We've covered Rohit has asked another question on the IP protection. Do we need a full-fledged act on drones and allied tech to protect the IP and avoid frequent infringements? No, you don't need a separate act for drones, Rohit. The current IP laws, which are again WIPO compliant, are very robust enough. In fact, as Tanya and Smith mentioned, right, basis this liberalized regime, R&D is going to propel, which essentially means that there is more and more IP which is going to be created. And the way I see it is, drones is not essentially only software. Like a typical IT company, there is a lot of intermingling of hardware and software. So there is a lot of future from a patenting perspective as well. Then there are further questions. Will there be restrictions on the import of DJI drones since the company is based in China? So specifically from an imports front, that is not within the purview of the DGC or the Ministry of Civil Aviation. The nodal agency for imports continues to be the DGFT, which is the Director General, Foreign Trade. They any which ways have a manual. They will stick to that manual, basis which drones can be imported in India. Again, before we kind of go back to the questions and considering the paucity of time, Smith, why don't you again come in and give your concluding comments basis the future of the Indian drone ecosystem, and then time permitting, we'll conclude on a few questions and then we'll move to closing remarks. So over to you, Smith, for your final thoughts on the future of the Indian drone ecosystem.
Thanks, Josefa. I think very simply put, it's going to be bigger drones, meaner drones, faster drones, AI and machine learning driven, analytics happening on the high resolution data that is being captured, and drone as a service being used, whether it's the survey mapping activities or the drone delivery activities that we keep seeing in the global market. It's going to be fantastic, and I think the use cases as well as the operations are just going to not kickstart but explode in the Indian market. So very important for people to leverage this ecosystem, and as opposite to various other ecosystems, the global ones, India in fact has liberalized it to the point that could be one of the easiest sandbox to test different types of applications, because absolutely like the core regulations have been liberalized, and you don't require unique permits and unique permissions for conducting research and development or exploring new use cases up to 500 kgs worth of drones. So that's my take, Huzefa. Looking forward to many companies coming into India, working with Indian partners, and building some large setups and large drones.
Thank you. I think, thank you so much. I think this is a very, very positive takeaway. Let's quickly look at the questions. I'll go in seriatim. Just like so this is Darshan Jariwala. He's asked us, just like air traffic control, will agencies be managing airspace? Will DGCA be responsible for creating an ecosystem? So the answer is yes. The new law itself contemplates of a air system traffic management, which is nothing but a UTM. There is a tentative timeline also, which has been given by the government with broad principles as to how it's going to function. So yes, the answer is yes. Darshan, they are looking at something like that. The next question, an interesting question from Sanjeev Sikka. He says that please share the maximum weight permitted. If this is 50 kilos, how do we foresee an air taxi? Actually, Sanjeev, it is not 50 kilos. The large drones are, above 150 kilos. And the way these rules are drafted, it says that up to 500 kilos of drones can be regulated, within these rules, and they are not subject to the aircraft rules. So up to 500 kilos is where, the possibility lies, not 50. And which is why, air taxis is something which can be considered, and which is what the minister has also said. Quickly moving forward, Smith, probably you can also chime in for this one. Should the regulator set up a formal sandbox environment to promote use case testing in a controlled environment?
For some use cases, yes. For example, drone taxis, I would really be scared if drone taxis are started, being tested on my head. There could be a sandbox requirement, but for the smaller ones, absolutely no. There is a freedom for you to, demarcate a piece of land. You don't need to own it. You can lease it. You can, just take someone's permission, not even lease it, and start testing all your smaller drones. So sandbox is required, but for a very specific use case like traffic management, collision avoidance, air taxis, but not a general sandbox for all applications, because then that would result in the sandbox restricting innovation and opening up of new applications.
I think just one important point here, for Sagar, and of course Smith has rightfully said, from an R&D perspective, basis the current law, most of the things are exempt, even a type certificate, even a UIN. So this is one thing which, I'm sure, down the path, the regulators may kind of relook at it, because there is no size restriction when it comes to R&D. So if it's something, really, really big, like say 250, 300 kilos, some amount of precautionary safety, guidance implementation in relation to the same would be very welcome. Quickly moving on, we have more and more questions. This is Dan Harder. He says that, can you talk about the requirements for filming in India, and if an outside drone from another country can bring in their own drones and operate? We did speak about this, Dan. Import is going to be possible of the drones. In fact, India is going to recognize the principles of reciprocity. If there are certain countries where the drone is already certified from a safety and security perspective, that could be imported, and it could be kind of actually flown subject to certain other requirements. So yes, that is a possibility, but who actually operates it needs to be carefully looked at, because the foreign national, as we discussed earlier, it may not be possible for that foreign national to operate it. Ravi Kumar, he says that if there's a collusion of the drones, then how the responsibility will be attributed. For this, there are certain guiding principles which are given in terms of safety and penal provisions. So accordingly, we will need to deal with it on a case-to-case basis. Moving forward, Rohit has an angle on the Legal Metrology Act with respect to drone weights. As of now, there is no correlation dependency, but this is something, of course, can be relooked at and reconsidered. But I don't think it would be, correlated. I'm just looking at. I think we've answered most of the questions. It's been super interactive. Thank you so much. And I think we've kept the clock also in good stead. It is right at the dot of an hour. On this note, thank you to all our participants, all our friends, especially the panelists. Thank you, Nishith Bhai, also for taking time out and joining the session. And we look at more and more exciting times. As we've all spoken about, yes, the regime is liberalized. We are all very positive. Safety, security, SOPs will come. We will need to comply. But I think the big takeaway is that the market is open and it's ready to conquer. Concluding comments, Nishith Bhai, over to you.
Absolutely fine. I think it was wonderful discussion, and appreciate your sharing all the thoughts. And I see a huge opportunity, especially as we move upward into different zones. And even as was mentioned, drones with even 500 kilograms is fairly large. I've seen some of those things happening when I was in Davos at World Economic Forum, and after the event was over, drones carried huge packets, and in the sky you can see those kind of things, which is not usual in India to see. So even trucks to some extent would be reduced, hopefully, or at least things would change dramatically. I think as air taxis and goods, services, a lot of things. The whole need for cutting trees and mountains and all those things may also be to some extent reduced, because that often creates environmental issues. So if drone is effectively and creatively used, we can make it a part of climate change, a core instrument, And as was mentioned, there are a number of applications. There are so many new opportunities created for a lot of people who can it's the imagination is the only end of the whole thing, So I'm sure that this discussion will inspire, hopefully, a lot of people to look at drone as a business and also as a contribution to the society for the coming times. Wish you all the best, and everybody have a very nice weekend. Enjoy your time, and have a successful business ahead. Thank you.
On this note, we conclude the webinar. On future events, you will keep receiving our invites, and you will be updated with our newsletters on topics such as these, including other disruptive technologies. Once again, thank you all for joining, and wishing you all the best, and welcome you to the liberalized Indian drone ecosystem. Have a good day. Bye-bye.